Hey, John. No, you can give me a call.
Okay, 4 more and we'll have a quorum. Stand by.
Thanks, Mary. What was that, Beverly?
That was Beverly.
Hi, Beverly.
Hello.
For those that have just gotten on, we're just waiting another minute. A lot of people are coming on and we're also making sure we have a quorum.
Okay, we do have a quorum.
Commissioner,
Okay.
you're on.
Sorry about that. Okay, well, again, we'll say good morning and I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend.
This
and that
conference
you're
will
able
now be.
And that you're able to get to the go-to meeting instructions. Just a few notes for this meeting. It is being recorded and live streamed on our website. And first, some ground rules for this meeting. Please mute your device when you're not speaking so we can reduce the background noise. And when you're making a motion or comment, please state your name so we know who you are. So for those of you logged in on the website or app, please use the chat box to indicate when you'd like to comment or ask a question. So that we can minimize the amount of people talking over one another. Ted will be managing the chat box and will call on people in the order that requests come in. After that, we'll ask for any comments from those of you joining us by the phone only. Are there any questions about this? Okay, with that, we'll start the meeting. I'll ask Beverly Morris to read the Open Public Meeting Act. Good morning, Beverly.
Good morning, Commissioner. This is to advise that in accordance with the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, PL 1975, adequate notice of this meeting has been forwarded to the Newark Star Ledger, the Asbury Park Press, the Courier News, the Daily Record, the Home News Tribune, the Jersey Journal, and the New Jersey Herald. Okay.
Thank you. So we'll have the roll call, please.
Bergen,
Peter Botsolis present.
Essex,
David Antonio, present.
Hudson,
Byron Nicholas, present.
Hunterdon,
Present, Carrie Fellows, non-voting.
Jersey City,
Arka Patel, present.
Middlesex,
Doug Greenfeld, present.
Monmouth,
Terry O'Connor, present.
Morris,
Kathy DiFilippo, present.
Newark, Ocean,
Jack Kelly present.
Passaic,
John Bartlett, present.
Somerset,
Walt Wayne, present.
Sussex,
Chris Carney, present.
Union,
Betty Kowalski, Union County.
Warren,
Jason Sarnoski is here for Warren County. I'll be signing off at 11, Beverly, and Dave Deck will be taking over for me.
okay. Governor's Office, NJDOT,
Andy Swords, present.
NJ
Neha
Transit.
Neha Galgali present from NJTPA.
I have Andy Swords from NJDOT. Okay, NJ Transit,
Jeremy Colangelo, present.
Port Authority,
Jay Sheffield, here.
Citizens Representative,
Present.
Jared?
Present. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Madam Chair, we have 17 voting members present and a quorum.
Terrific. Thank you, Beverly. Are there any, with the approval of the minutes, are there any corrections, additions, or deletions to the minutes of September 13 board meeting? Seeing or hearing none, may I have a motion to approve the minutes? And when you make the motion, please state your name and the county that you are representing.
Jack Kelly.
Do I have a
motion.
motion?
Jack Kelly,
Thank
Ocean
you.
County, make the motion.
Motion,
Thank you. And do I have a second?
Jason
Terry.
Sarnoski.
and Warren.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Thank you. Are there anyone opposed? Is there anyone who needs to abstain?
Yes, Middlesex abstains. I wasn't present for the full meeting.
Thank you. All right, then the minutes are passed, Beverly.
Yes, minutes are approved, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to take this opportunity to present my report. And thank you once again for joining us. I'd particularly like to thank Chavez Stewart for joining to discuss the future of micro-mobility in our region. And I really look forward to his presentation today. But first, I'd just like to note that this is an exciting time for all of us involved in planning and programming federal transportation investments. As I'm sure you've heard, Congress has passed a new infrastructure bill into law, and the president is expected to sign it very soon. I believe next week when Congress comes back into session. I'm pleased to note that all 12 members of Congress from New Jersey supported this bipartisan legislation. The new measure will significantly increase transportation funding overall, with approximately $12.3 billion coming to New Jersey over the next 5 years for transit, roads, and bridges. It also includes new or increased funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, ferries, broadband, and more, as well as funds that can be tapped for the Hudson River Tunnel project and related improvements, helping to build on the momentum already generated by the recent groundbreaking for the Portal Bridge replacement. The NJTPA looks forward to working with our partner agencies and our subregions to make transportation investments that, in keeping with Plan 2050, will increase opportunities for all the residents of our region. So stay tuned in weeks to come for more information about this very important legislation. On another note, I'm pleased to share an important milestone for our Street Smart New Jersey campaign, which just surpassed its 200th partner. This includes campaigns held in partnership with municipalities, counties, and colleges across New Jersey. This milestone would not have been possible without the many partners that have worked to make this program such a success since its first started in 2013. I especially want to thank various police departments, the New Jersey Division of Highway Traffic Safety, the Transportation Management Associations, the Federal Highway Administration, the NJDOT, and for everyone who's out there on the road and paying attention to signs like crosswalks. Of course, engineering solutions are critical for improving safety on the roads, but it also takes education, enforcement, and through programs like Street Smart to change the behaviors that contribute to these fatal crashes. During my time on the NJTPA board, I've been honored to help kick off some of these campaigns, one in Morristown, another in Dover. I know several of the board members have also participated in similar events in their subregions. With all of us working together to raise awareness and change behaviors, we'll help New Jersey work towards zero deaths. And I want to make mention that in addition to the program and stopping at a crosswalk, it's also terribly important to just walk, look at your surroundings. Making a right-hand turn at an intersection is very dangerous if there's someone in the crosswalk. So we always have to be paying attention. And Street Smart program helps us to do that. Turning to another topic, I wanted to let you all know that Morris Canal Working Group will once again meet next week. The working group, I'm sorry, I thought it, yeah, maybe it is next week. The working group, which is coordinated by the NJTPA, was on a brief hiatus during the pandemic, but exciting work has been happening along the former canal. Anyone interested in the Morris Canal is invited to attend the virtual working group meeting on November 17. I believe that's next week or the week after at 10:30 in the morning. And details can be found on the NJTPA website. So again, that's November 17 at 10:30. The Canal Society of New Jersey will be providing an extensive update at the meeting, but I wanted to highlight a few canal-related projects in Morris County, my hometown. The next phase of restoring Incline Plane 2 East in Roxbury Township began this fall, thanks to the funding from the Morris County Trust for Historic Preservation. Archaeologists are examining previously unexplored areas and stonework is being repaired. This is very exciting. This is literally walking distance from my home. And when the work was first done years ago, it was just an amazing history in our backyard that we could bring guests and walk over to and read about and get down on your belly and look down into the ground. So I'm really excited that we're going to have archaeologists there on the property again, and I look forward to whatever comes of that excavation. Roxbury Township's Open Space Committee will also be working with the Canal Society to create a new interpurpose signage for visitors next year. I apologize for that. But for some new signage around our Roxbury next year for the canal. Work is also continuing at Lot 2 East in Wharton. This is an extensive project that's been funded by the NJTPA, as well as Morris County and New Jersey Historic Preservation Trust. Work is underway to reconstruct the Locks Tender House. This project will also extend the water-filled section of the canal beyond the head of the lock. That is just a beautiful sight if you haven't been up to Wharton to see the Morris Canal. The ultimate goal, of course, is to tie in all the various greenway segments together in a unified trail. Planning the Morris Canal Greenway is just one example of a region-wide issue that the NJTPA successfully helped coordinate. It's among the many projects included in our long-range transportation plan adopted by the board at our last meeting. And if you'd like to see more about the 2050 plan, that is also on the NJTPA worksite. The plan outlines ways to improve walking and biking, help towns create complete streets, and enhance their transit assets, address climate change through resiliency planning, and prepare for technology advances. If you haven't had a chance to review it yet, again, you can find it on the NJTPA website. But before wrapping up, I also wanted to mention that as part of the phased reopening of various agencies and authorities, the Governor's Authorities Unit has rescheduled the full reopening of the NJTPA office to November 29. While the office will be reopening, we have been instructed to continue to hold our meetings virtually until further notice. This includes the committee meeting in December. They will be held virtually. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you. Do we have any remarks from the NJDOT this morning?
So not at this time. Thank you very much, Chair.
If you're talking, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
NJDOT, any remarks this morning?
I can hear DOT.
All right, Ms. Filippo, can you hear me?
Sorry, New Jersey Transit, any remarks this morning?
I think we're having a little technical problem.
Yeah, must be having a problem. They've responded several times.
Dave, just want to be sure, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Wait,
Can you hear
DOT,
us?
can you hear us?
DOT did say that he had no remarks this morning.
You're muted.
Okay, since we haven't, Mary, would you kindly present your report to the board?
Yes, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you and good morning. Central staff has been working on a wide range of activities since our last meeting. Those efforts are guided by Plan 2050, which the board approved in September. The long-range plan identifies the many priorities guiding this work, and staff is actively integrating these into our new and ongoing planning work. Several initiatives are commencing or are already underway. For example, staff is engaging in consultant selection for development of an active transportation plan beginning early next year. This responds to the strong support we heard around the region for making walking and biking safer and easier. In a related effort, we continue to work with our partners at Rutgers Voorhees Transportation Center and Sustainable Jersey to provide technical assistance for municipalities seeking to implement complete streets. This aims to make streets more walkable and accommodating to all users. The application period for the 22-23 program will open on December 6th of this year, and 2 informational webinars will be offered during December. Improving equity is another key focus of Plan 2050. One way we are working to advance this goal is our recently launched Outreach Liaisons pilot program. This effort aims to recruit volunteer community members to help advance public involvement in the agency's projects and programs, particularly for underserved communities. The liaisons would help facilitate communication between the agency and the communities. Applications are being accepted through the end of the month. Please visit our website for more information. Addressing climate change continues to be an NJTPA priority in keeping with Plan 2050. We are part of a technical advisory committee that met in October to initiate an update of our regional greenhouse gas inventory. Other committee members include representatives from US EPA, NJDEP, NJDOT, Jersey City, and the 2 other metropolitan planning organizations in the state. The NJTPA is also developed a web page of resources to help businesses and local governments accelerate electric vehicle adoption. Turning to the area of freight, the NJTPA is helping raise awareness and promote cooperation to address the goods movement issues we've been hearing about in the news. While our port has not been as badly affected as others, we face burgeoning e-commerce and industrial development, which is altering land use and truck travel patterns. On September 17th, staff helped organize a multi-state freight working group meeting for the Metropolitan Area Planning, or MAP Forum. The meeting focused on industrial real estate trends and issues affecting member agencies in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Discussions on related topics took place at our last Freight Initiatives Committee meeting, which you will hear about shortly. We also continue to focus on safety-related efforts. This includes our Street Smart program, as noted by the chair, as well as our support of ongoing local safety projects and other local projects to address aging infrastructure. These are just some of our current activities addressing the priorities of Plan 2050. This will continue in fiscal year 2023, which will begin this coming July 1st, with a new Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, which is now under development. As we advise the board each year around this time, now is the time to begin identifying priorities for the coming year's annual work program. We are looking to release a draft work program in December and plan for committee review early next year with board approval slated for March. Examples of work included in the draft fiscal 23 work program so far are updating the prime planning tool and notice project information system, revalidating our transportation model, supporting new technology implementation such as adaptive and optimized signal projects, funding for another round of planning for emerging centers projects, conducting additional local safety audits around the region, hosting symposia on Plan 2050 topics, supporting the work of Together North Jersey, including the local technical assistance program, and much more. The subregions and transportation management associations will continue to be our close partners in these and other activities as they advance their own efforts to address regional priorities in Plan 2050. On a related note, the NJTPA website now features the findings and final reports of 4 subregional studies completed in fiscal year 21. All these studies address critical local issues, and 5 additional subregional studies are now underway. A group of new studies are being considered for funding for the coming year. So Plan 2050 provides the foundation for many important planning activities, and we look forward to doing much more. Again, I urge you to share your input as we develop the new work program for the coming year. Now, before closing, I'd like to announce that on December 3rd, the MAP Forum will be holding its annual meeting hosted virtually by NJTPA. You can find the information in the events section on our website, as well as a link to the MAP Forum website itself. I encourage you to check it out to learn more about this group's activities. And that concludes my report. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that. Before we go on to introduce our special guest today, did NJ Transit come back? And they said they didn't have a report, Mary. What was that before?
I don't believe they had a report. I think there were some technical difficulties.
Okay, and the same with NJDOT or?
Jeremy, did I jump the gun?
Yeah, that's correct, Mary. No report. Obviously, we're looking through the bill passed Friday night, and certainly excited about the possibilities there. That's it for me.
Great, thank you.
Great.
Thank
you, Jeremy.
Can you hear me? This is Andy from DOT.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Just very briefly, yes, we are also very excited about this bill. our commissioners making it a top priority to review the contents and make sure that we're prepared to move forward with all of the contents. There is a great deal to be excited about. It really is a once in generation piece of legislation. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes, I think a lot of people in the transportation industry are very excited about this bill and the opportunities that it will present across the country. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. The presentation is the future of micromobility. So we're planning for 2050 presentation. Mr. Chavez Stewart, who is the founder and CEO of UNI, a team of advocates, designers, and policy experts who build modular streetscape infrastructure for bikes and scooters. Previously, Mr. Stewart served as Deputy Directors of Operations for the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, where he had oversight over customer services and quality assurance for the Fulton Mall Improvement Association, which is the business improvement district for the third busiest retail district in New York City. Before that, as project manager at New York City Department of Education, he worked closely with the Urban Ambassadors Program, which he helped to create. The program provides leadership training and mentoring to young men. He earned his bachelor's degree in political science, communications, and sociology from Tufts University. And with that, please help me welcome Chavez Stewart. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
That was an awesome introduction. I just want to say thank you to the NJTPA. Excuse me, I'm recovering from a cold, so just if I stumble, please excuse me. I think before I get into the presentation, I want to highlight a little bit about who we are. A lot of that in the introduction, I think, gets to the point I was about to make, but we approach this work primarily from the paradigm of policy and how we can produce efficacy, more so than how can we create a business framework that we think is very interesting. And I know that sounds a little bit astounding, but we view ourselves as a team of advocates that started the process with the whiteboard and looked towards creating a policy framework that we thought would work, and then figuring out how to build a business model that could allow that policy framework to scale. That makes us a little bit different, and I'll get into some of what we do later in the presentation. But next slide. I want to talk a bit about micromobility, what it means, and why it's relevant as we think about the next chapter in our transportation landscape future. So micromobility is a term that I think is thrown around quite a bit. It's a term that's about 4.5 years old. It actually comes from Europe, and it's an attempt to kind of encapsulate this growing field of small mobility vehicles that are under 100 pounds, usually under 50 pounds, that tend to go between 0 and 30 miles an hour, right? Typically 25 or under. So what does that look like? It looks like the traditional bicycle. The bicycle is the OG of micromobility, but it also increasingly looks like e-bikes, scooters and e-scooters, skateboards and one wheels. And there's some other form factors that we're seeing on our city streets that, the Segway, for example, right? Things that are small, things that don't move as quickly as our larger vehicular counterparts, but are designed primarily for short and medium range trips. And then also we have to include our mobility as a service operators as well, bike share, scooter share. We're seeing an increasing array of subscription services and flexible ownership models where you can buy a bike or rent a bike or rent a scooter for a period of months and then return it for a monthly fee. And then bike parking infrastructure, obviously we fall into that latter category. Next slide. So who does micromobility serve? And I found that in our conversations with advocates and with cities, there's this kind of, and especially with the media, actually, there's a massive misperception that exists. That micromobility, that bikes, that scooters primarily serve affluent white middle-aged men, and that's actually not true. So typically, we do find that working class folks, immigrants, and minority folks are more likely to ride bikes and to ride and take advantage of micromobility. Generally, in America as a whole, immigrants are 2 times more likely to bike. And those earning less than $35,000 and living within a dense residential area such as northern New Jersey are 10 times as likely to use a bike. We do find that micromobility continues to skew towards men, and there are a few reasons we think that contribute to that reality. But generally speaking, the actual constituency of micromobility is much more diverse and much more nuanced than folks might think. So here we have on the right, a picture of a deliverista. New York City has 80,000 delivery workers, the majority of whom are working class, the majority of whom are Black and brown and Asian, and many of whom are immigrants and folks who are even ESL, English as a second language. As we have a conversation regionally about bike infrastructure, these folks bear the brunt of our bike infrastructure deficit. And that's something that as policymakers, we have to keep in mind as we continue to advance this conversation. Next slide. I think as we talk about what micromobility is, what the potential is, we have to understand that this is really the fastest growing segment of transportation in America right now, and it's not really even close. So a lot of the statistics that I'm going to cite are from New York City, because New York City just is a nationwide leader in just releasing data. But a lot of these trends are true for our northern New Jersey municipalities as well. So 700% increase in cycling since the year 2000. We've seen e-bike sales over the past 2 years really surge, especially during the course of the pandemic. And we've seen municipalities, New York City and beyond, really commit to robust bike lane growth, right? I'm not going to necessarily say bike infrastructure, but bike lanes, right? How do we create on-street space that can accommodate these new mobility form factors? Next slide. And as we think about why this is so important, there are a few reasons, but I think the most important things to highlight here about why micromobility can really be helpful to a city of any size, foremost primarily is traffic congestion. 50% of domestic car trips are under 3 miles, 20% are under 1 mile. And here in New York and northern New Jersey, we've got a real transportation traffic crisis where our streets are clogged. We've seen the rise of ride hailing really contribute to on-street congestion. Now, if we can just get half of the people who are making trips under 3 miles to convert over to micromobility, then the dividends will actually benefit not only people who are drowning in traffic in public transportation, on buses, but also drivers, people who are going beyond 3 miles, who take longer trips, are emergency workers, people in ambulances. So we're going to see dividends across the playing field, whether you are calling 911 because someone is having an emergency, or whether you are taking a cross-state trip, or whether you're on a bus looking to go across town. Migrating over those trips to more efficient forms of transportation is something that will really benefit cities as a whole. You can see here a famous diagram which compares a bus, 60 people on a bus, 60 people on bikes versus 60 people in cars. I think what people fail to realize about micromobility is that, it's spatially very close to public transportation. The second reason I want to highlight is transportation integration. So research tells us that micromobility boosts a catchment area of transit by about 200%. So if you've got a subway station, if you've got a commuter rail hub, people can walk to that station. Let's say they're willing to walk 4 blocks. If they bike, or if they scoot, or if they use a one wheel, it can be 12 blocks or more, right? And so we're looking at a much larger zone of efficacy for for our transportation facilities, our public transportation facilities, excuse me. And finally, an improved passenger experience and access, access paradigm for public transit. We find that in other cities, particularly London, showing up with your bike or with your scooter and then having to drag it on the train because there's not a place to put it is something that is considered a real friction point. So having these kinds of facilities at transit hubs can really lead to a better passenger experience. Next slide. Now, I think when we talk about micromobility and where we're headed, we have to kind of leave behind our old paradigms. So what is micromobility not meant to encapsulate? Recreational rides, traditionally rides to the park, a fun lifestyle amenity. I think you've got folks who are, for whatever reason, they think in the confine, often developers of micromobility as, a nice kind of fun thing to do to get around the neighborhood, or a really cool economic way to attract young people to a certain space, right? You hear this in the context of bids often. I used to work for a bid, or a SID as you call it in New Jersey. We can have some bike lanes, and if we have bike lanes, we can attract millennials or we can attract Gen Z. I prefer to view micromobility as a form of public transportation that's no different than car trip or highway or a transit line, and that is a fundamentally different paradigm than how we used to look at bikes and scooters and all in that bundle. Excuse me, that bundle of mobility options. Next slide. Excuse me. So I want to talk briefly about trends that we're seeing, and then a bit about our work, and then some recommendations that I have to mull over for the group. Part of the reason why we think that micromobility is going to continue to grow and is on pace to account for 1 out of 5 urban trips is because we're still seeing strong municipal investment in cities across the board domestically. We're seeing cities invest not only in bike lanes, but bike share. And we're seeing cities release fairly progressive bike master plans that are mapping out the next decade of how we're building the bike network. So I think 4 years ago, the conversation was, is micromobility a fad? Given the track record of investment we're seeing, it's clearly not a fad. We're clearly going to see robust growth and a strong adoption curve going into the future. Next slide. We're also seeing the private sector, particularly our friends in venture in Silicon Valley, really invest billions of dollars into private operators, both on the mobility as a service side, but also increasingly on the OEM side. And this is a really, really stark difference from basically anywhere before 2015. So prior to 2015, micromobility companies were largely existent, in the exception of Motivate, which ran City Bike, largely confined to recreation, largely confined to sport, and largely confined to lifestyle. And then, when the first bike share companies started to really take root, Silicon Valley noticed and started pouring in billions of dollars. And now we're thinking largely in the terms of building public transportation and expanding access to casual adopters. And that's really transformed, as many of you know, what we think the options could be for our communities. We have companies that are pretty well funded, willing to come in and loss lead, and I'll get to that in a minute, willing to come in and loss lead in our communities and create basically a form of public transportation. Next slide. So what are the friction points that we're seeing as we really enter the next chapter in this micromobility revolution? We have a strong focus on safety. I think policy-wise, when you look at any bike master plan, when you hear DOTs in northern New Jersey or beyond present, oftentimes the conversation is centered on how we can make cycling or using a bike or scooter safe in the urban context. Now, I'll be provocative for a second. I live in Brooklyn. No one rides the subway in Brooklyn and says, it was really safe this morning. No one flies in a plane and says, my flight was safe. Safety is a necessary but hardly sufficient foundation to which a competitive mode of transportation can be built. So we need to start thinking about bikes and scooters as real public transportation, and to develop a paradigm of services and experiences around that make it not only safe, but convenient, competitive, and reliable. Now, to that end, limited parking, limited service opportunities. Here in New York City, because we have virtually no secure bike parking, and this is true in Northern New Jersey as well, bike theft is rampant. 1 out of every 4 households in New York City has experienced bike theft. In cities like Montreal, 1 out of every 2 cyclists has experienced bike theft. 7% of people who experience bike theft actually don't replace their bikes. So as we think about the saliency of that challenge, people who already bike, when you ask them why they don't bike more, it's because there's no secure parking. When you think about servicing these bikes and scooters, where you have a car, you drive, you know that having gas stations, having dealerships, having places you can take your car when it breaks down, that ecosystem is really critical. But for those of us who own and use our own bikes and scooters, which is 95% of the market, you're in the Wild West, right? We are still operating in terms of our service capacity, very much like an optional lifestyle, recreational kind of transportation mode, and not like a everyday, I must use this to get to work kind of transportation mode. Unsustainable economic models for micromobility operators. So to be blunt, when you talk to folks in the mobility and service sector, they're all pretty candid about the fact that their companies aren't making any money. And they're in an environment right now which allows them to loss lead. And that financing is going to dry up pretty soon. And so for those cities that see dividends and benefits to be gained from having private sector operational partners to provide micromobility services, how do we keep those private sector partners alive and well so they can continue to be above water and viable? And then lack of comprehensive transportation planning. So, going back to the first point, if we're thinking about this ecosystem as being ancillary to the form of transportation that we're hoping to see metastasize in our communities, how do we paradigm shift so that we are thinking about the holistic experience of those who use bikes and scooters, not just can they arrive safely? Next slide. I'll talk a little bit about what we do, and before I talk about some of the recommendations I have and take some questions. UNI is an attempt to think holistically about bike infrastructure and to tackle parking and service. So, back in 2016, we noticed that, people who are friends, people who were in the downtown Brooklyn community kept on having their bikes stolen. I had 3 bikes stolen over a period of 5 years. And as someone who, I live 2 miles away from my job, cycling was perfect in terms of a transportation option for me to get around, but it wasn't really viable if I couldn't park confidently. And we discovered that there really was no turnkey model for how to provide this infrastructure to urban communities. So we have OEMs like Darrow, Bike Fixation, Cycle Hoop in England, that sell infrastructure to vendors and they walk away. But the needs are so much greater than that. So we take on advocacy, we take on planning, we take on design, we take on financing, and then we take on operations so that cities can have a scalable turnkey solution to this infrastructure. And we're much more like an intersection of JC2Co, where we operate the solution in partnership with our urban partners, rather than say an OEM, which just basically manufactures and then walks away from the deal after they sell. So we actually don't sell to cities. We look for the right to operate, and we use advertising and sponsorship revenue to support the infrastructure. Next slide. We launched 3 stations in the New York, New Jersey area, 1 in Jersey City, 1 in downtown Manhattan, 1 in downtown Brooklyn. And we are working with a variety of partners to build out the next 45 in 2022 and beyond. And the goal is to get to a regional network. Transportation in New York, New Jersey is regional. Can we have a transportation system that is also regional, right? And we're seeing consolidation with Omni. We're seeing the MTA, the Port Authority, New Jersey Transit start to think about how we can have a common fare payment experience. That should also be true with micromobility infrastructure. We're also working domestically with cities such as Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Seattle, Miami, and Portland. Next slide. We envision our infrastructure to be much more than just bike parking. Eventually, want to offer services through an app experience that can use the bike infrastructure as a fulfillment nodes in the network. So if you need a tune-up, you park your bike, you go to work, you go home. You can use our app to connect with a local bike shop. That bike shop can come to the asset where your bike is stationed, unlock your bike, tune it up on site, and put it back, and then you can return and ride your bike and have a fresh tune-up experience. This is really critical because right now, as I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to find a uniform service delivery model in this transportation space. It would be unthinkable if your car broke down and you called AAA and they said, sorry, we are only around Mondays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. Otherwise, you're going to tow it yourself, right? There is always someone there to help you when you're in a vehicle. There's always someone there to help you when you're in public transportation. We need to find that same sort of companion concierge experience for micromobility. Next slide. Part of our model is working closely with advocacy groups, elected officials, and sort of grassroots community-based actors to build support for this kind of infrastructure. We found that in many of our target markets, frankly, there's a lot of trepidation, at DOTs in taking this on. We have to kind of articulate in concert with, our neighbors, why this infrastructure is not just needed, but is a priority. And so, we're proud of the fact that here in New York, we've been, enthusiastically supported by the incoming mayor. We're actually hosting an event with him next week, but also by mayoral candidates in the city council. We've worked closely with every major advocacy group in the region. And so that's very much part of our model. Next slide. So, as I conclude, I have several recommendations to think about how we can get to the future we need, where we can really provide a viable alternative to cars and vehicular trips. One is, there's been a really strong cohort of bike master plans. I think Jersey City is a really excellent one. For example, as cities start to contemplate how we can, what their bike master plan is going to look like, one of the things that's really near and dear to us is starting from scratch and thinking about the user experience. And that starts with data collection. So focus groups, who are our users, who bikes, who doesn't bike. We need to have both of them. So the folks who bike, what would make you bike more often? What are the pain points of your experience? For the folks who don't bike or don't use micromobility, what would allow you to consider this as an option? Start with the data collection and design your bike master plan around a ground up data collection apparatus. Expanded master plans that include not just bike lanes, but parking, service, and mobility operators. So for example, here in New York City, one of our recommendations to the city government is we've got concessions on the Hudson River Greenway and the East River Greenway for restaurants. The city has accepted that our retail footprint in New York is so expensive that at some of our top tier destinations, it's going to be acceptable to have a Shake Shack that we rent out to Shake Shack or a local food purveyor. We should take that same approach with bike shops. Have city sponsored concessions along major bike routes in kiosks, that can provide services and have rules set aside for their operating hours and have cheap rent so they can afford to stay in business. We've seen this model employed in Los Angeles and San Francisco with and their transportation networks with bike hubs. We think it'd be very successful here. Citywide RFPs that merge bicycle and scooter share. So here in northern New Jersey and New York City, we're one of the few places in America where bike and scooter share can subsist on sponsorship revenue and or nominal investments from from cities. We think that we should start to look at combining bike and scooter share and having joint RFPs for those kind of services, primarily because these companies aren't sustainable and will need to be able to tap into additional sources of revenue, particularly that advertising and sponsorship revenue, in order to stay afloat. And then finally, city bike parking, municipal bike parking incorporated into street furniture paradigm. So, excuse me, here in New York and in northern New Jersey, traditionally, bus shelters. New York has 3,500 bus shelters. We have 400 newsstands. We have 1,700 Lincoln YCs. We have 1,000 city bike stations. We have ads on trash cans. So starting to think about bike parking facilities of all sizes in the context of that street furniture paradigm, that protected class of street furniture assets that we can allow sponsorship revenue to help offset. And again, this particular market is one of the few in this country where that model is viable, and using that revenue stream to take advantage of this new generation of infrastructure, and then to catalyze micromobility growth as a whole. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm, again, just recovering from a cold, and I look forward to your questions.
That was an amazing presentation. And I can think of so many places where I've traveled where that would be just wonderful to have that type of mobility. But let's open the floor. Do we have, Ted, do we have any questions in the chat box? I thought I saw, yeah, 2 questions.
Yes, that's correct. 2 questions. Somerset County, Ken Wadeen from Somerset County asked whether your expansion plans include expanding into less dense areas like downtowns, main streets in New Jersey suburbs, the older suburbs of the region.
Ideally, they would. I mean, we operate in partnership with cities as they make space available. So generally, the approach we advocate for is for cities to release an RFP, like we release an RFP for any city service, with a bundle of rights attached for advertising and sponsorship, et cetera. And that allows us to present a plan and allows other people to present a plan, which can be duly adopted by that particular municipality. So, right now we haven't seen less dense areas take that action. We've only seen Jersey City, and I believe Hoboken is considering it, and New York City is considering it. Take that step. That's our recommendation. And that, again, it requires a bit of a paradigm shift, because that's how we typically approach street furniture and programs in other types of service provisions. So migrating that approach here.
Another question from Trevor Howard, City of Newark, kind of a 2-part question. What role has venture capital played in the growth of micromobility, and has venture capital artificially inflated its popularity, then expects government to subsidize the programs when the venture capital runs out?
Yeah, okay. That's a great question. So starting with that second part first, I'm just going to give my opinion. I think when you look at the trend lines, micromobility was already growing prodigiously well before venture capital got involved. So starting in the year 2000, and then up until the year 2015, we didn't see venture capital play a really strong role in cultivation. Bixie started in Montreal back in 2005. City Bike started in 2013. None of these were really venture capital backed endeavors. What we saw happen, with venture capital was bike share in China took off, and that was a big bubble. And I think a lot of folks have forgotten that. But bike share in China took off, and Blue Go-Go, Lime, and a few companies here were going to emulate that model. And looking to what happened in China, venture capital saw a way to scale up bike share sans infrastructure. So City Bike, the first generation of bike share systems had a really strong infrastructure presence. They were entrepreneurs that convinced investors that basically if you just kind of leave bikes on the sidewalk, that could be a way to see really aggressive scale that could produce 100x returns and forego the traditional downside. I say that with quotation marks of working with government, working with communities, and dealing with infrastructure. All the things that provide value. So I don't think it was an artificial inflation. I think it was venture capital coming in and seeking to co-opt really strong trends and seeing the co-opt excitement and growth that we've already saw. That being said, the model of basically dumping bikes and scooters on city streets and circumnavigating local government, local communities was never sustainable. For context, no public transit agency, I believe, no public transit system, I believe, in the country makes a profit. It's a very challenging space to make a profit. The airlines don't make a profit. They get bailed out every 10 years or so. Companies that make a profit in the space, if you think about the MRT in Hong Kong, for example, they profit on real estate. They don't profit on transit directly. So there are indirect opportunities to derive revenue and derive profit, but providing public transit as a whole is not a great way to do that. And so if the model for rideshare barely worked, Uber and Lyft still don't make any money really, then the model for basically dumping a scooter or a bike on the ground and trying to back your way into a strong business case was never really going to work. That scooter often only lasts 4 months, and the battle now is can make it last 6 months. But even if you break even, it still doesn't make it interesting. So having spoken to a lot of folks in the industry, I think what the hope is that these programs, these companies can generate enough efficacy where they get to, at some point they get to a city and they say, look, we're a strong part of the transportation landscape in your city. Is there a way that we can work out a subsidy? And I think that for bike share, that's not actually far-fetched. We've seen cities, of all sizes subsidize bike share, right? We've seen Boston, we've seen San Francisco subsidize bike share. So they're looking, I think, to follow that model. The big question is, will that case of efficacy really get to the point where cities feel comfortable, going out to bid and providing a subsidy so these companies can stay afloat? I don't know if that's going to happen, but I wouldn't characterize it as they're looking to artificially inflate popularity statistics and then basically shove this on city government. I'll remind folks that 95% here in New York City, 95% of the market is personally owned micromobility. It's not bike share. City Bike's a great program. It's desperately needed here in New York City, but to say that City Bike's driving adoption would not be accurate.
We know equity is a huge issue in transportation. We have two equity related questions. One is from the Port Authority. Jay Sheffield asks about the potential mismatch between revenue sources and social equity. And then from our partner NPO, Njdot in New York, are the current trends in micromobility addressing the needs of families with small children, the elderly, and the disabled?
Okay, two great questions. The Port Authority question first. I think the reason why cities need to take a strong role in designing RFPs is so that we can have a citywide conversation about what are the needs of our communities. Right now, basically the paradigm that we're incorporating micromobility services in is basically permits. We're going to allow these companies to operate and we're going to give them an operation zone. I don't think that model is going to ever really produce efficacy that aligns with our needs as municipalities, because these companies, they're charging $5 to go 2 miles. You're just not, it's not competitive with public transportation. It's not competitive with walking. It's just, it's always going to produce an equity deficit. With Uni, 60% of our users are non-white. 25% are below AMI, at least, because a lot of them don't answer that question. And working cyclists are about 1 out of 5 of our users. So we know that equity is possible in terms of how we can introduce this kind of infrastructure. We know that there are 80,000 delivery workers who rely on bikes and scooters, not just to get to work, but to work. So we know that there's a strong constituency for for equity here. It's just allowing these companies or allowing operators to align the bottom line with those equity goals. Now, how do you do that is the obvious question. I think New York City and other big cities have a really strong model. I'll list 2. Bus shelters and newsstands. New York City has 3,500 bus shelters. They're fairly evenly distributed within the context of the city. That's because New York City has a really strong advertising market, and New York City has really been, I think, quite cogent in how it approaches advertising-based public-private partnerships. So in the case of the JC2Co contract here, the city said, if you're going to get 4 bus shelters in Times Square, we need to get 10 out in East New York, right? If you're going to get 4 in Soho, we need to get 20 in the Bronx, because we understand how this works. The Lincoln NYC program, same model, right? If you're going to get 4 in Manhattan, we need 10 in Staten Island, right? So we've got fairly strong networks across the 5 boroughs of these services. Now, with City Bike, it's a little more challenging because City Bike is contiguous, whereas bus shelters and newsstands and Wi-Fi kiosks aren't contiguous networks, right? So we see the sponsorship model kind of reaching its saturation point of how far it can expand before it no longer makes sense. But New York City, has made a decision not to subsidize City Bike even nominally, and so that then becomes a challenge. But there are ways to structure those kinds of agreements. So what I would contemplate is, instead of having a permit paradigm, we have a sole operator paradigm where one operator wins a contract and it has to meet certain benchmarks to maintain that contract, very similar to how we award bike share contracts. And that way it becomes economically interesting for that company to make investments, not only in servicing neighborhoods across the economic spectrum, but also in infrastructure. Right now, if you've got, LA's got, I think, 10 operators, each one knows they could, there's no financial incentive to really take a long-term investment in that community, because why, right? You've got all these competitors. You're basically looking to stay afloat. You're not making any money anyway, because the business model isn't sustainable. Now, in terms of the second question about access, I'm really encouraged. I'm really encouraged in the e-bike and e-scooter revolution. I'm also really encouraged just to see a conversation starting within many of our planning agencies around mobility lanes, micromobility lanes, and not just bike lanes, for 2 reasons. One, e-bikes and e-scooters really allow people who are traditionally not able to power a non-powered vehicle to take advantage of those mobility dividends. And so we can see, people who would be physically fragile, frail, disabled, really being able to use e-bikes as a way to go the distance, or use an e-scooter. Now, for those of us who are either elderly or otherwise, incapacitated, to have a chair that moves, a powered chair, to be able to use that wider micromobility lane, to be incorporated within that broader paradigm, is actually also very healthy, very exciting. So there's a lot of conversations here in New York City about, wait, who are bike lanes really for? And is bike lanes the right moniker for what is really space on the street for small mobility? And you're seeing the American Association for Disabled Folks come out and say, no, bike lanes are important, because if you're in a wheelchair that is electric, it's much easier to ride in the bike lane than it is to ride on the sidewalk, right? The surface is much smoother. You're not speed constrained. And so we can see this revolution really benefiting a broad constituency, not just people who are on bikes and scooters.
I'm just checking the chat box to see if there's any additional questions. Neil Weissman had a comment and posted a link, but I think that's it for the questions.
Can we open it up to the public? Anybody on the phone who may want to, well, in case somebody wants to think of another question and type it in. Meanwhile, maybe we have people who would like to ask a question on the phone.
I see in the chat box, Chair, that Trevor Howard, City of Newark, asked, what are the specs for a micromobility lane, travel lane?
I don't think there's a Bible for what a lane looks like. I mean, because I think so. When the bike lane when bike lanes started, being common in cities, we started planning bike lanes. They were often pretty narrow because we designed them for one bike, maybe two bikes to ride alongside each other, and so 5 feet wide was not uncommon. Now we're starting to have a more nuanced conversation about what is micromobility, what is powered micromobility versus what is pedal micromobility, and it's become evident that we need to have maybe a passing lane. So you're going to have folks who are riding on powered micromobility devices that are going 20, 25 miles per hour. You're going to have folks that are pedaling, they're going 10 to 15 miles per hour, right? Is there enough room to pass? Is there enough room? Is there a shoulder to make a turn, right? And so typically I would, contemplate a micromobility lane, a bike lane, as being as wide as a car lane, going in one direction, so that there's ample room for people on wheelchairs, people who are riding e-bikes, but also people who are riding conventional vehicles. You want to have ample room for multiple speeds and for all of the activities that one might expect to experience on the course of a trip, an average trip, right? Where if you stop and check your phone, you don't need everyone behind you to be screaming at you, right? You can pull over. So those kinds of contingencies need to be thought of as well. So typically a car lane is what I would contemplate it as, but I think the conversation is still very much in flux.
Thanks for taking time to answer these questions. If anybody else has additional questions, Mr. Stewart had posted his email. Perhaps we can follow up, so we're respectful of everyone's time.
Thank you for having me.
Chavez, that was a delightful presentation that just, I can't thank you enough for your time today. It really opened up food for thought for municipalities. I want to just comment about the electric wheelchair. I see that somebody was concerned about electric wheelchairs and bike lanes. Where I've seen that has been on rails to trails, particularly down in Florida. It's not uncommon for a scooter or a electric wheelchair to be in the lane with traditional bicycles, e-bikes, and walkers. And as you had said, the lanes are wider when you do rails to trails. But I think a lot of it has to do with civility, that people are kind to each other on the trail, that you're aware of people who may not hear you. I think it's important to have a bell. But I've seen it work. And yes, maybe there can be an accident because you are mixing so many different people, whether you're in a wheelchair or bike or walking. But nonetheless, I've seen it work, and I think it's a great opportunity to get people out. But I also want to comment, Chavez, you had said about disabled people, handicapped, being able to actually ride as a result of an e-bike. And I wholeheartedly agree with you there. I think e-bikes do open up the opportunity for people who cannot ride a traditional bike for any length of time or to keep up with people on the trail. So I agree with you there. In any event, wish you well in your venture. I look forward to actually seeing some of your pods. Is that what you call a pod?
We're figuring out the nomenclature.
And I'd be curious, one last question for me is, have you had any problems with municipalities or cities concerned about the aesthetics of a pod in a parking space with wrap all around it? Have you found that some municipalities are more concerned about the aesthetics?
No, because our response to concerns are usually what can, the way we have conversations with cities and why we think RFPs and bids are best practice here is because we view the city as our client. We are a B2G business. And so the way the conversation usually happens is a city says, here's what we need. And can we see a proposal for us to get there with you? So, the co-founder of the company is an architect. We design the infrastructure to look good. We are well aware that a sponsorship and advertising-based model isn't going to work on a residential street in a brownstone neighborhood. We are well aware of the complexities of urban real estate. And so our approach typically is one size does not fit all. Can we design something that works best for the community? And here in New York, we have seen a lot of success, with folks embracing the look of the infrastructure, and that's basically our prototype. We know we can do a lot better, but we find that there are two concerns that we often get. One is not the aesthetic, but we often get a concern around maintenance. Particularly with the larger structures, are people going to sleep inside? Are we going to have illicit activity taking place nearby? And we're able, to provide a layer of service in terms of operational know-how that usually quickly allays those concerns. And then we usually have conversations with communities about, what they need, what they want to see, how, having it work for everybody. And finally, when you're able to tell people, look, we're serving the community for real. We're not serving, we're not serving the affluent. We're not serving people who are non-representative of what it looks like. There are people in your community who rely on this for transportation. It's quite critical. Usually the tone of the conversation shifts. I think people are more tolerant of divergent aesthetic when they know it directly benefits their neighbors and maybe them, right? And so for those reasons, we typically have not seen all the feedback we get, we typically have not seen that feedback generated. I will tell you the feedback that usually we get as a small startup is releasing a bid or an RFP is a major undertaking, as many of you know, and oftentimes cities don't have the bandwidth to engage in that process. And so we often get a lot of head nods. We get folks who say, this is great. However, we need to find a champion somewhere to take this on because I can't do it, right? And that ends up often being the key barrier to adoption from a municipal level.
Thank you. That's good information. Thank you. Again, thank you very much for your time this morning, and look forward to seeing the growth of micromobility. With that, we're going to start our committee reports, and I'm just realizing that we're so close to 12 o'clock. Commissioner Bartlett, are you still available that you can do the Project Prioritization Committee report?
Yes, ma'am, and happily it's very short. Okay. I am pleased to report on the activities of the Project Prioritization Committee. At the October joint meeting, the committee considered one action item. It concerns a minor amendment to the fiscal year 2022 through 2025 Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, to utilize federal disaster recovery and resiliency program funds as requested by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Two projects that were anticipated to be authorized in federal fiscal year 2021 could not be obligated by the deadline for year-end financial transactions. These projects, both in Hudson County, need to be included in the new TIP with adjustments to funding and scheduling. These projects are the concrete seawall east of Harrison Car Maintenance Facility and the Harrison Car Maintenance Facility automatic flood barrier. Both are ready to be authorized for construction and must be amended into the current TIP, with each project programmed for $3.1 million in federal funds and $352,000 in Port Authority matching funds. This is listed as action item number 1 on today's agenda. Also at the meeting, we heard a presentation on the development of the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, which Mary previously highlighted. Regarding the TIP, the new work plan will include continued improvements to management of the capital programming process, as well as updating the criteria used for prioritizing projects. Staff also will utilize the effectiveness of implemented projects and strategies to guide future investments. That concludes the Project Prioritization Committee report.
Thank you, Commissioner. And the minor amendment to the fiscal year 2022 to 25 Transportation Improvement Program to utilize the Federal Disaster Recovery and Resiliency Program funds as requested by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. We have some attachments, but in the interest of simplifying our board action for this online meeting, we've been asking board members to be prepared to offer a motion in a second. So if you'll bear with us, I understand that the Port Authority would like to move this item.
Yes, so moved by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey.
Thank you. And would Hudson County like to second that?
Yes, Hudson County seconds.
Thank you. Do we have any comments from the board members about this action item? Any comments from the public on this item? I take it in the background, Ted or Melissa. Melissa, you're checking to see if anybody wants to speak?
Yes, ma'am. Nothing in the chat box at this time, and I don't hear anybody on the phone comment.
Okay, with that, Beverly, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Bergen?
Okay.
Yes.
Essex?
Yes, Beverly.
Yes.
Hudson?
Yes.
Jersey City? Barca?
Yes.
Middlesex?
Yeah, yes.
Monmouth?
Yes.
Morris?
Yes.
Ocean?
Yes.
Passaic?
Yes.
Somerset?
Yes.
Sussex?
Yes.
Union? Union? Warren?
Yes.
Governor's Office?
Yes.
NJDOT?
Yes.
NJ Transit?
Yes.
Port Authority?
Yes.
Citizens Representative?
Yes.
Motion is carried.
Thank you, Beverly. Now I'll call on Commissioner John Kelly, Chair of the Planning and Economic Development Committee, to give his committee report. Good morning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the October joint meeting, the committee considered one action item concerning NJTPA's annual support for federally required statewide safety performance measure targets. NJTPA coordinated with NJDOT, the New Jersey Division of Highway Traffic Safety, and New Jersey's other MPOs to analyze trends and set targets for 5 performance measures established by the Federal Highway Administration. These safety performance measures include 5-year averages for the number and rate of fatalities, the number and rate of serious injuries, and the number of non-motorized fatalities and non-motorized serious injuries. Target setting this year was particularly challenging given both the change in reporting for serious injuries initiated in 2019 and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The group took guidance from the 2020 Strategic Highway Safety Plan and set targets for a 3% drop in annual values each year. The committee was also informed that NJDOT has prepared a federally required Highway Safety Improvement Program implementation plan to improve its ability to achieve its safety targets. The plan describes how funds will be allocated to safety projects, strategies, and other activities. Under federal regulations, with previous targets not being met, the state has limited flexibility in how it uses safety funds until the new targets are met. As a result, extra attention will be paid to the delivery of all safety projects statewide. Importantly for the NJTPA, this includes our local safety program, which uses federal highway safety improvement program funds for safety improvements. This is listed as action item number 2. At the meeting, we also heard a presentation on the recently completed Hudson County Ferry Service Expansion Study, which was funded through the NJTPA Sub-Regional Studies Program. The study evaluated the feasibility and market demand for expanding ferry service to serve travel within the county. 4 sites for potential ferry landings were examined, finding that though sufficient demand currently does not exist, future development may make the services possible. Madam Chair, this concludes my report.
Thank you, Commissioner. So for action item number 2, support for safety performance measure targets for 2022 set by the New Jersey Department of Transportation in collaboration with the NJTPA and other metropolitan planning organizations in New Jersey. I understand that NJDOT would like to move this item. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, that is correct. So moved.
NJDOT, are you going to move this item?
Madam Chair, that is correct.
Thank you. And Monmouth County, will you second it?
Yes, Terry O'Connor from Monmouth County seconds this.
Thank you. Any comments from the board members? Thank you. Anyone, any of the board members wish to make any comments on this action item? Hearing none, are there any members of the public that might like to speak?
Seeing none, Chair.
Okay, we don't see anything. Yes, no, no one. Okay, I don't see anything in the chat box and, okay, then, Beverly, will you please, call the roll?
Yes. Bergen,
Yes.
Essex,
Yes.
Hudson,
Yes.
Jersey City,
Yes.
Middlesex,
Yes.
Monmouth,
Yes.
Morris,
Yes.
Ocean,
Yes.
Passaic,
Yes.
Somerset, Sussex,
Yes.
Union, Warren,
Yes.
Governor's Office,
Yes.
NJDOT, Andy?
Yes.
Okay. NJ Transit,
Yes.
Port Authority,
Yes.
Citizens Representative,
Yes.
motion is carried.
Thank you, Beverly. Next will be the Freight Initiatives Committee report. And I believe that Commissioner Charles Kenny is not with us today. And forgive me, I am trying to find, I had to switch windows. I believe I'm giving that report. Okay, so I'm pleased to report on the October meeting for the Freight Initiatives Committee on behalf of Commissioner Charles Kenny. Last month, where we heard our first annual air cargo industry update, as well as a briefing on marine highway initiative that UPS is pursuing in our area. Our first speaker was Brandon Fried, Executive Director of the Air Forwardness Association, who said the air cargo industry has played a significant role in addressing the current overflow of goods in the supply chain. Traditionally, most air cargo handled by forwarders has been flown in the belly holes of passenger jets. Now, however, increasing air cargo demands have prompted all major carriers to repurpose some passenger planes to full cargo carriers by loading packages onto passenger seats. He noted, though, that labor shortages and airport congestion are limiting air cargo expansion. He also discussed growing concerns about cybersecurity threats and the need to ensure that goods containing hazardous material are not shipped as air cargo. Next, Chris Littick, Director of State Government Affairs at UPS, said the company is exploring new services for moving truck trailers by barge or ferry between New Jersey and New York to avoid highway congestion and to reduce environmental impacts. The marine highway concept was tested this summer and is undergoing further development in collaboration with marine operators, the Port Authority, and other partners. At the meeting, we also learned that despite national supply chain problems, the Port of New York and New Jersey is functioning with minimal delays, as Mary mentioned earlier. This is in contrast to the large backlog of ships waiting to be unloaded at West Coast ports and at some other US ports. This is despite the much higher volumes that the region's marine terminals are now handling. In addition, we heard about the recently completed Union County Truck Mobility Study. The study findings are available on the NJTPA website. And this completes the Freight Initiative report. And forgive me for a moment, folks. Ted, are we open it to the public now? Is that where we're at?
Yes, I believe public comment is next. We have two speakers that have signed up in advance to speak. The first is Neil Weissman.
Hi, Ted.
Good morning, Mr. Weissman.
Good morning. Ted, do we have the screen up or there we go? Okay, so my name is Neil Weissman, Pete George, and I've also posted a link to extended remarks in the chat. As part of a $2 billion renovation, the Port Authority will soon open the north path across the George Washington Bridge. Walkers, runners, cyclists will flock to see it. By spring, their numbers will explode, but that's when its failure as a public infrastructure will become clear. To place the agency's plan in context, it is important to acknowledge that demand for active transportation has surged over the last decade, and particularly the last couple of years. And transit agencies have paced the trend with far-sighted designs to increase access. The Port Authority gave us the raised Bayonne Bridge with a 12-foot bikeway, and its new Goethals has a 10-foot path. Both projects now facilitate one-hour commutes to Lower Manhattan. Cyclists and pedestrians cross the Cuomo Bridge on a 12-foot path, and they can spread out over the 20-foot Kosciuszko. This spring, the New York State Legislature passed bills calling on the MTA to extend bike access across its 7 bridges. In September, New York City converted a bike lane on the Brooklyn Bridge to eliminate perennial conflicts with tourists, and committed to double bike capacity across the Queensboro by the end of 22. So in this context, that the Port Authority has rebranded the bike path across the George as the North Walk is regrettable. but it is not unexpected given the liability. Can you scroll down a bit on the there you go. So in this context, given that the liability, they're going to have cyclists and pedestrians to interact on what is a substandard facility. Nonetheless, the Port Authority's decision will have long-term impact on the region. 2 examples. First, if you presume that New York State will move forward in some form of congestion pricing, we should expect the city to follow by restricting non-resident parking in Upper Manhattan. In this scenario, a widened George could support a park and ride system for tens of thousands of New Jersey commuters. Second, as ably presented by Mr. Chavez, micromobility presents a unique opportunity for urban transport. They're cheap, effective, sustainable, extremely popular. Their rates of adoption far exceed electric vehicles. They don't require expensive charging stations. They reduce congestion, and their net emissions are a fraction of full-size EVs. But because they stress the level of service on even modern bikeways, their sustained adoption will depend on new infrastructure that enables safe operation, which is why the Port Authority's choice not to support use across the George is such a lost opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weissman. And I understand we have someone else who would like to speak, Ted?
Yes, I believe he's on the phone. If he's still with us, it's Tim Severner is next.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, sir.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So Tim Severner from Transit Village of Mount Tabor, director in the New Jersey Association of Rail Passengers. First item is all rail advocates would really like to commend New Jersey Transit for the announcement that they're adding 36 more trains, because we've been arguing for years that one of the things you need to do is just run the trains on the lines we have. And the biggest improvement is hourly weekend service on the Main and Bergen rail lines. So that's a major step forward, and hopefully we can see more of that. Like, another thing that makes sense is to do hourly to Hoboken service, Police, Montclair State University to Hoboken, hourly. That's one thing. The other thing is rail electrification. I've spoken about this before. I forwarded a UK recent study of why they're electrifying their rail. Because diesel trains limit the power available, while electric trains' power is only limited by electricity it can receive from the overhead line. Instead of carrying a battery pack, storing the same energy as a typical diesel rail passenger vehicle would weigh an extra 40 tons and so double the weight of the vehicle. Typical comparative estimated efficiencies are for electric 80%, battery 65%, hydrogen 25%, diesel 25%. Just as with electric cars, electric trains are far simpler because you don't have the complication of a motor, which then has to be translated to electricity to run the train. So it's easier to maintain. The life of the vehicles is longer, and you save money on maintenance because it's simpler. Another thing, part of that, is that you can have EMUs, electric multiple units, and while New Jersey Transit is ordering more double-decker EMUs, that does not necessarily make sense for all the lines. Metro North and the Long Island Railroad have single-level EMUs. The advantage of an EMU is, unlike one locomotive, which can break down, every other car can have independent power. So you can have like just a 3-rail car set. And I think what most riders really want is frequent service. They don't want to wait for 2 hours like they do now before this increase on the Main and the Bergen line for service. So you can have EMUs, which should be more reliable, and then powered by electricity. We already have 300,000, this was pre-pandemic, electric rail riders in New Jersey. And the great advantage of electric rail for decarbonizing transportation has been totally ignored by all the hoopla about electric cars, which is not to say electric cars shouldn't be done, but we really need to invest in electric rail with overhead catenary service, and then hopefully powered by solar renewable energy. The two segments that we need.
Excuse me, your 3 minutes is up. Could you wrap it up, please?
Oh, yeah, okay. Three segments that could be done in the NJTPA area is from MSU to Denville, from Dover to Hackettstown. And the Raritan Valley line currently is diesel. And parts of that could be converted to overhead electric. That's it.
Thank you for your comments today. Thank you. Ted, is there anyone else in the chat box, or should we pause for a moment to see if anybody else on the telephone would like to speak?
Yeah, nothing else in the chat at this time, Chair.
Okay. Then just before we close the meeting, I do have some comments, and let's see. I'd like to remind everyone that the NJTPA board will elect our new officers for 2-year terms at our January meeting. In the coming days, I'll be putting together a nominating committee, and over the next few weeks, that committee will confer and determine a group of candidates for the executive committee positions. The nominations will be announced at the January meeting and followed by a vote. If anyone is interested in making a nomination, please reach out to myself or to Mary Amin. And thank you, everyone, for that. Our next virtual meeting of the NJTPA board will be Monday, January 10, 2022 at 10:30 a.m. With that, may I have a motion to adjourn, and please remember to state your name and county. Motion to adjourn?
So moved. Dave Sheffield from Port Authority of New York, New Jersey.
Thank you. And a second?
Second, Somerset County.
Thank you, Somerset. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, for your time. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Okay, looks like we're out. There we go.